The night was as deep as ink, and the rain that had fallen earlier had left a shiny, wet film on the asphalt that reflected the headlights. Tom, a little tired after a tiring day, decided to take a shortcut through Mary King Road. His GPS confirmed that this was the shortest route, although he was a little hesitant in his heart. Since childhood, he had heard stories about this road, eerie tales of ghosts, of a girl in a wedding dress who supposedly appeared on the side of the road and disappeared under mysterious circumstances. But he was a grown man, rational, and wrote off these stories as local fiction. His brand new sedan glided flawlessly along the road, but the silence around him began to press. The trees that leaned toward the highway created the illusion of a tunnel. Even the radio, which he had turned on for company, began to fade out, producing only snatches of music mixed with static. Soon Tom simply turned it off, leaving himself alone with the sounds of tires splashing the remaining puddles. Suddenly, something jumped across the road in front of the car. Tom's heart sank, and he slammed on the brakes reflexively. But it was only the reflection of the moving shadows of the trees and the headlights. He shook his head, trying to banish the growing anxiety. The road ahead seemed endless. Time seemed to have stopped, and the world outside his car became alien. Tom began to feel that the landscape around him was changing. The trees that had previously seemed simply tall now seemed to be pressing down, their branches reaching out to him as if trying to grab him. His fingers tightened their grip on the steering wheel when something unexpected appeared on the horizon. A figure stood on the side of the road. A white robe shimmered in the headlights, and Tom thought it was just a reflection. But as he approached, the figure remained motionless, watching him. Tom didn't want to stop. He gripped the steering wheel, his eyes fixed on the figure on the roadside. His heart was beating faster, and his thoughts were flitting between logic and fear. Is someone in trouble? But who is standing here at this hour? The figure slowly raised a hand, calling him to stop. Tom felt the adrenaline rush through his blood, forcing him to drive closer. The headlights slowly illuminated the girl in the wedding dress. She looked eerie. The white garment was wet and crumpled, the torn hem hanging in shreds. Her hair was disheveled, like a silk web, framing her face, but he could hardly see her features because of the thick shadows. Tom slowed down and rolled down the window, taking a deep breath to hide his fear. "Are you okay?" She didn't answer right away, but came closer. Her gait was slow, as if her feet were only half touching the ground. Finally, she leaned toward the window, and Tom saw her eyes. They were sad, empty, but there was a quiet, invisible thread in them. "Can you give me a ride home?" Her voice was weak, like a distant whisper that resonated in his ears. Tom didn't know why, but his body acted faster than his brain. He nodded and unlocked the door. The girl silently walked around the car and got into the back seat. The door closed with a dull sound that made him flinch. He started to move, feeling the damp cold enveloping the cabin. In the rearview mirror, he could see her sitting upright, staring out the window, but as if she were absent. "Where can I drop you?" Tom asked, trying to sound confident. "The old house near the cemetery," she answered quietly. His fingers tightened on the steering wheel. Tom knew the place, an abandoned mansion of local legend. His heart clenched with anxiety, but he forced himself to focus on the road. The minutes ticked by. The car was oppressively quiet, with only the engine making a steady humming sound. She didn't say anything else, but Tom couldn't shake the feeling that her gaze was occasionally glancing at him through the mirror. Every time he caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of his eye, his gaze met only her motionless figure. Soon Tom sensed something else, a smell. At first it was a faint, sweet scent, like old flowers that had been in a vase for too long. The smell grew stronger, mingling with a hint of dampness, like after rain. "What were you doing out this late on the road?" Tom asked, wanting to break the silence. The girl didn't answer right away, and her voice sounded as if it came from a faraway place. "I was waiting." "Waiting for whom?" he asked again, but there was no answer. Gradually, something in her presence began to frighten him more and more. He felt the skin on the back of his neck goosebumps. The shadows of the trees outside the window seemed to move, but their shaking did not match the speed of the car. When he looked in the mirror again, it seemed to him that her face had changed. He tried to catch the details, but it seemed that the headlights were not able to fully illuminate her figure. She looked a little blurry, as if she were part of a thick fog. Tom lowered one hand from the steering wheel, wiping the sweat from his palm, and whispered to himself, "Just get her there, then everything will be fine." But deep down he knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The road became winding, as if trying to pull the car deeper into the darkness. The trees seemed to grow taller, their branches stretching over the highway, creating a dome of shadows. The headlights pierced the thick gloom, illuminating only a few feet ahead, and everything around the car seemed frozen in the cold air. Tom could feel the tension building, squeezing him from the inside. His heart was pounding, and his hands were sweating on the steering wheel. Glances in the rearview mirror became inevitable, as if he was drawn to check if the girl was still there. Her figure remained motionless, staring out into the night that flickered outside the windows. But every time he looked, he was overcome by a strange feeling that her silhouette was becoming a little different. The car came to a fork in the road. The navigator, which had been malfunctioning, suddenly came to life. The screen flashed, and a voice prompt told him to turn left. Tom didn't know whether to trust the system, but instinctively followed the instructions. The road became even narrower, and a thick fog enveloped the car. It seemed as if time had slowed down. Every second stretched out, turning into minutes. The car moved forward, and eventually he saw it, a building rising in the gloom. It was an old mansion, abandoned and gloomy. The windows were empty with black holes, and there was a dead silence around. Tom stopped the car at the shabby gate. His heart clenched with fear, but at the same time he couldn't bring himself to move. The girl was still sitting in the back, motionless, as if she were part of the night. He felt the temperature in the car drop even more, and at one point he caught himself not being able to make his legs move to get out. And then it happened. A slight movement in the rearview mirror made him focus on her figure. Her head began to rotate slowly, as if dragging along the fog that had entered the cabin. But the face he saw was no longer human. It seemed blurred, as if frozen in water, and the eyes were black holes from which thick darkness oozed. Tom realized that he had to run, but his body did not obey. Suddenly, the car's engine stopped, and the headlights went out, leaving him in total darkness. The silence turned into a low, pulsating sound that filled his head. Out of the darkness that enveloped the mansion, the outlines of other figures began to appear. They approached, slowly and inevitably, their blurred faces radiating the same hopeless emptiness. Tom felt their presence pressing down on him, as if they were draining him of his very essence. He summoned all his will, tore open the door, and ran. The gloom, the fog, and those figures seemed alive, embracing him from all sides. The road, which had seemed so short before, now turned into an endless maze. Tom ran without looking back, his heart pounding and his lungs burning from the cold air. The darkness seemed to be chasing him, his every step echoing with a sound that seemed alien. The fog grew thicker, almost tangible, and turned the night into a living trap. Ahead, he saw a faint light. It was breaking through the gloom, flickering like a kerosene lamp. But with each step he took, the light grew farther away. His legs were giving out, but Tom kept moving, clinging to the hope that this was the way out. Glancing over his shoulder, he saw them. The figures from the same black void he had fled now grew around him. They didn't run, they didn't scream, they just slid silently after him. Their outlines were blurred, as if they were blobs of darkness themselves, but their eyes, black holes, pierced through the gloom, recording his every movement. The light ahead faded, and Tom realized that he was in the middle of a forest. Huge trees rose up, their trunks seemingly twisting into endless spirals. Every breath of air seemed to drain his strength. He fell to his knees, looking down at the ground, and saw traces of moisture, the same traces the girl had left on the seat of his car. The silence was broken. It wasn't a scream or a whisper, but a deep sound, like the roar of underground water. Tom felt the sound fill his head, making him dizzy. His gaze suddenly fell on something on the ground in front of him. Wilted white roses covered with dew, lying as if waiting for him. And then he saw her. The girl was standing at a distance, but this time her figure was clearer than ever before. She didn't move, but her black eyes were glowing, burning him with their gaze. Her wedding dress swayed gently, as if from a wind he could not feel. Tom tried to scream, but no sound escaped his throat. He tried to stand up, but his legs would not obey him anymore. Other figures reappeared around him, standing in a silent circle as witnesses to his doom. Suddenly, he felt his body begin to tremble, and coldness penetrated his skin. The girl raised her hand, and the light seemed to dim. The figures began to move closer. Their outlines became clearer, and darkness flashed in their black eyes. A new sound came from the depths of the forest, an engine. The headlights cut through the darkness, stopping in front of Tom. An unfamiliar car, old and shabby, stopped a few meters away. The door opened, and a voice inside shouted something, but Tom could barely understand the words. He stood up, gathering all the strength he could muster, and ran to the car. The figures froze, as if they could not cross the line of the headlights. Tom climbed inside, and the car started. He looked over his shoulder and saw the girl standing in the middle of the forest, her eyes still burning and her hand outstretched toward him. The car sped forward, breaking through the fog and gloom. Tom sat in the passenger seat, shivering with cold and fear. The driver, an elderly man with a stern face, said nothing. His eyes remained fixed on the road, and his hands held the steering wheel tightly. Tom tried to compose himself, but the sounds from the forest were still in his head, rumbling and soft whispers that seemed to haunt him even here. He wanted to thank the driver, but the words stuck in his throat. It seemed hard to breathe in the car, as if the air was saturated with something invisible. The car had traveled for several miles when Tom noticed that the landscape around him began to change. The trees gradually parted, and the fog became clearer. Ahead, he could see the outline of a different road, with normal markings and occasional lights. Tom felt his heart calm down a bit, but his eyes fell involuntarily on the rearview mirror. In the reflection, he saw the back seat, and there, in the dim light of the cabin, something moved. A shadow, barely visible, grew out of the darkness. Tom pressed against the door, trying to avoid the mirror, but he felt a chill run down his spine. The car suddenly stopped. The driver turned to Tom, his face calm, but his eyes expressing something indescribably sad. He gestured to the door, as if calling him to get out. Tom hesitated, but the door suddenly opened on its own, and cold air rushed into the car. When Tom got out, he looked around. He was standing on an empty stretch of road. No fog, no trees, just the starry sky above. But the car was gone. It had disappeared as suddenly as it had appeared. Tom slowly returned to the highway. He was sure that he was safe now, that everything was behind him. But when he took a few steps, he saw something on the side of the road. His car. It was standing there with its headlights off, just like when he had stopped to pick up the girl. Tom walked closer. There was something on the back seat. A bouquet of white roses, wilted and covered with dew. He felt a chill penetrate his skin when he noticed a note neatly placed on top of the flowers. In the moonlight, he could read the text. Asterisk, I'm still waiting. Tom felt his legs give out. He looked around, but the road was empty. But when he turned his head again, there she was standing in the distance just on the side of the road. A girl in a wedding dress, her black eyes burning in the darkness. She raised her hand, waving to him, inviting him back.